Hello everyone, and thank you for joining us today to the Embodied Cognitive Science Seminar series. Today we will have two talks, and as always we are recording, but we will pause the recording for the discussions. For the first talk, we are very happy to welcome Charles Lenay.
Yes.
I'm sorry if I'm mispronouncing. Charles is a full professor of philosophy and cognitive science at UTC in France. He seeks to understand how tools and technical devices participate in cognitive activities such as perceiving, reasoning, memorizing, interacting, and engaging in social cognition. He created a minimalist experimental method allowing a dialogue between cognitive psychology and phenomenology, the visual glove, perceptual crossing experiment. He has developed a series of perceptual supplementation devices for blind people to give a tactile access to digital environments, Tactos, Intertact, and DAO Tact. He has directed 11 theses, published nearly 100 articles, books, and lectures, and filed 3 patents. And today he will be talking about how, in order to improve our understanding of adaptability, sense-making, or emotions, we need an explanation of the perception of a multiplicity of possibilities. Professor Lenay, thank you very much for joining us today, and the stage is yours.
Thank you, everybody. Do you hear me well?
Yes.
Okay. Yes. So thank you, Tom, and all the Embodied Cognitive Science Unit in Okinawa for this invitation. So I would like to present here some research to understand the ability to consider multiplicity of possibilities. As a disclaimer, I must say that this research is still in progress, and I will only present preliminary results. Yeah, and I make this presentation in the hope of receiving criticism and suggestions. Yeah, really. That's all. So, what I want to understand is how a multiplicity of different possibilities can be thought simultaneously. The question here is not that of the possible as a power or as a disposition, but rather as a multiplicity of different cases. It seems to me that no claim to explain cognitive activities or lived experience is valid if it does not propose a way to resolve this question. For the sense-making, the meaning of positive or negative value for the organism itself needs the presence of a simultaneous multiplicity of various alternatives, good or bad. There is no adaptability without anticipating possible danger that are not yet realized. There is no finality without the possibilities that the goal will or will not be achieved. But can we propose a mode of naturalization of the cognition of a field of possibilities? It seems easy to understand that the existence of a thing is only possible, but it is more difficult to admit the existence of these possibilities as such. That's a problem. So, to approach this difficult question, we will limit ourselves to the case of spatial perception. Indeed, the perception of an object, exteriority, in space is essentially linked to the question of the possible. Space can be conceived as a phenomenal field of simultaneous multiplicity of possible position and path. Also, the current perception of one of the face of an object in the three-dimensional space is associated with all its other faces that would exist for other possible point of view, as Husserl explained with the idea of internal origin of an object. And more importantly here, we can recognize that the ecological importance of the perception of things at a distance depends on possibilities. The distance from the predator or the prey finds sense in the present multiplicity of their possible position and route. This phenomenological experience is charged with its own issues and value, danger and desire, which only have meaning through what can happen and which depend on spatial and temporal proximity. Thus, our question is not how to determine a distance, but how to perceive the object in front of us in exteriority, in a field of possibilities. To try to answer, we will limit ourselves to an enactive approach for which the object can only be constituted, enacted, within the framework of the structural coupling between the organism and its environment. Within the organizational closure, the coupling domain corresponds to the set of links between perturbation and structural change that produce structural states. This coupling domain can be specified according to the repertoire of action and sensory feedback available to the organism. As we will see, this is what allows an experimental approach. But in this framework, how to explain the perception of a separation between our point of view here and the position of the object there? So, to answer to that, I propose this plan. First, a question, how long is my talk? At what time I have to stop? Please remember me.
So if you can please stop at 4:10 Japanese Standard Time. So
sorry, at what time?
4:10
in half an hour.
In half an hour.
In half an hour. Okay, all right. No, I'm afraid I plan to propose an experimental approach to this question of the perception of possibilities from the study of the condition of the perception of distance in space. We will first as quickly as possible, see an individual sensorimotor solution of distance perception, and then, because this first one is insufficient, an interactionist approach focusing on perceptual processing and its limits. I would like to show how inter-individual interaction allow to constitute a space of possibilities. So, just to remember that a few years ago, we developed an experimental device whose aim was to construct the simplest system sufficient to observe the appearance of objects at a distance. It's the visual glove. It consists of a simple photosensitive cell attached to the index finger and connected to a single stimulator held in the free hand. When the light passes a threshold, stimulator is activated. After a few minutes of use, blindfolded subject managed to perceive the direction and distance of target. Initially, the subject only perceived a succession of tactile stimuli which accompany her movements, but quite soon, she no longer noticed these sensations, which are replaced by the perception of a target at a certain distance in front of her. What we need to understand then is a sort of switch in perceptual experience, which started out at a series of proximal events, that is the tactile stimulation in the hand, and which at some point becomes centered on objects which are separate from the body in a distal space. I remember that, but we have made many studies and some with Malika about this great question. But here I need to go ahead to explain just a few points. Yeah. it is that one of the keys to this switch seems to be the activity of the perceiving subject, movement of the receptor. It is quite understandable that it is possible to look at the target even if the movement of the subject are simplified and reduce the movement, just to movement, the movement alpha from the elbow and the movement beta of the wrist to aim at the target. Very clearly, at least in the case of this minimalist device, the perception is not an internal representation, but the result of a dynamic coupling between the organism and its environment. By our action, the subject seeks and masters the constant rule which relate action and sensation for a specific position of the target. It is what Kevin Regan and Alvanoe call law of sensorimotor contingency. For each point of the distal space, there is an infinity of possible point of view on it. For each target position, there is an infinite pointing curve. An infinite pointing curve. But look very quickly, this explanation does not really make it possible to explain distality. Indeed, the mathematical explanation that we have just given realize precisely the refutation of what it aimed to show. The geometric space in which one can write the curve of the law of sensorimotor contingency, for example, this space between alpha and beta and the curve. This space can be explored in a tactile way. The exploratory movement of the subject can just as well be considered as the movement of a finite receptor field in this space. This is what will happen if this curve expresses the control of 2 degrees of freedom of a robotic or virtual arm with a computer mouse. In the space of the law of sensorimotor contingency, where this law is written, there is no distal perception, because or you see things like that you are body in space that aim at the target, or you see things like that you are a little receptor field in a 2D space. The laws are the same. So there is no explanation of the difference between these two models. Not that this failure is general. Any explanation of the disabilities that will mobilize coupling law in a deterministic dynamic system can always be represented by a curve and interpreted in a proximal way. There is no functional difference between the distal space where a target is in front of a point of view and the proximal space where the behavioral trajectory cross the curve of the law of sensorimotor contingency. The second is a complete description of the first. The first is a model of the system of relationships described in the second. And yet, there is a huge difference in meaning. The missing ingredient for the switchover between proximal and distal to occur cannot be in the law of individual coupling. So we have to look elsewhere. Our hypothesis is that this missing ingredient can be found on the intersubjectivity side, the dynamic of interaction. There is an important difference between proximal or distal perception, a difference which does not stem from a difference in individual sensorimotor function. It is the reciprocity or not of perception in an interindividual encounter. In proximal, so tactile interactions, perception is necessarily reciprocal. I cannot perceive someone without being perceived by her. In distal, visual interactions, perceptive reciprocity is only possible. I can perceive someone who perceives me, but I can also perceive someone who does not perceive me. This difference is important. Knowledge of non-reciprocity is certainly one of the main ecological needs of an animal. The distance from the predator or to the prey finds sense in the present multiplicity of the possible route and position that depend on whether I am seen or not. One of the first uses of perception is to know if one is perceived, if one counts for the other, prey or predator. Have I seen without being seen? Have I been seen without seeing? This depends on the spatial and temporal proximity. This is certainly the main ecological reason why we have, as animals, the ability to perceive at a distance. Note also that this issue of non-reciprocity is particularly important in child development, as Vasubedi shows in many texts. In fact, to understand non-reciprocal perception is to understand that others may not pay attention to me, even if I pay attention to them. This is a form of separation from others. We hypothesize that this is more fundamental than spatial separation and that it should be used to understand the constitution of the lived experience of distance. But how can we account for the lived experience of perceptual non-reciprocity? How can we see that we are not seen? To start this research, we have to set up minimalist experimental paradigm in the continuity with the classical perceptual crossing. So, to go back to the classical perceptual crossing, it is a situation with a perfect perceptive reciprocity. In our early research, we wanted to show that this situation of interaction allows the mutual recognition of the intentionality of another subject. That's the study we have done with Malika a few years ago. In order to make it possible to proceed to a precise analysis of the mutual dynamics, we propose a minimalist experimental paradigm. Two subjects installed in two separate rooms and can only interact through virtual space where the repertoire of action and sensation are reduced to the extreme. Each subject is reduced to a single receptor field that activates a tactile stimulator when it crosses a black cell. Let us note that for interaction to be possible, it is necessary that the receptor field of each participant is associated with a body object, that is, receptor field of each participant, that is a shape that can be perceived by other users, but that the participant does not perceive himself. And you need not only this receptor field, but a body object that the other could see. So here in this situation, it's perfect reciprocity when one participant touches the body object of the other, is himself touched. This interaction dynamic has been studied in numerous experiments. It was shown, and I'm sorry to explain it again here. It was shown that participants were able to recognize themselves, at least to differentiate the partner's object body from other fixed or mobile objects. This recognition is explained by a hitch between the perceptual activities of the two participants who perceive each other. The subject oscillates around each other and then develop more complex strategy like turn-taking. Let us note here that the subject admits without problem that the perceptual space is one-dimensional and horizontal. Also, they perform with their trackball or mouse up-down movement on the y-axis, as well as right-left movement on the axis. They understand that only the second one have a meaning for their perceptual activity. Indeed, the movement along the y-axis cannot make a difference since the receptor field corresponds to an infinite vertical line. If the object is here or anywhere on this line, it's the same thing for the subject. So y-axis don't exist for the subject. We now introduce a bias in the interaction space. In this space, the movement of the two subjects are now on two different axes that intersect with an angle of 20 or 30 degrees. This change is invisible for each subject that is still moving right-left on its x-axis. However, as we will see, interaction dynamics are changed. Yes, for the subject, each subject still is in a horizontal, one-dimensional space. But from the point of view of the experimenter, there is this bias between the two space, the two coupling domain of the two subjects. So, by introducing this sample bias into an interaction space, we can identify three regions according to the distance to what we will call the interaction center, the place where the two individual spaces cross. First, near this point, reciprocity is necessary. It is a mode of proximal interaction, like touch, where one cannot touch without being touched. Then, a little further on, reciprocity is only possible. It is a mode of distal interaction, like vision, where it is both possible that our eyes meet or that we see without being seen. In this region, as you see here, I can be seen if I'm A by B without seeing B, but I can be seen and see in the same time. And finally, far enough from the interaction center, reciprocity is impossible. If I perceive you, it is impossible for you to perceive me. And if you perceive me, it is impossible for me to perceive you. So one can move here continuously from a region where the reciprocity of the perceptual crossing is necessary to a region where this reciprocity is only possible, then to a region where it is impossible. That's still complicated, but it becomes more complicated in a way. That we have also allowed up and down movement along the y-axis in the interaction space. The subject does not know if these up-down movements of the trackball are taken into account. In the individual space of action, the phenomenology is still that of a one-dimensional space. Indeed, their movement in the y-axis have no effect on their perception, but only change their mode of interaction by changing the position of the interaction center. So that's the situation, and so I've not so much time to detail the experiment. I will just give some preliminary results that can help for the discussion. So we put the subject in two different rooms. They interact only through the system. They have many phases of interaction. We ask them to move together in one side or to the right or to the left. And we record all the perceptual trajectory. One of the main tasks is asking to the subject to be as much as possible in contact and moving together in one on the right or moving together on the left. What are the main results? First result is the result for about the movement on the x-axis. One way to see that is to look at the average speed of the subject depending of the distance to the interaction center. Here it is the interaction center. Here are the limits of the what I call the visual region territory, and after perceptual reciprocity become more and more impossible. So we look at the average speed of the participant according to the distance from the interaction center. The average speed are negative on the right of this point and positive on the other side. It is quite easy to understand. There is a kind of factor at the interaction center. Indeed, the mutual research for a perceptual crossing leads the subject to get closer to the interaction center. If the instructions require them to move away from it, we see that the collective movement becomes more and more difficult until it becomes quite impossible. So if the subject, as I try to show with this little animation, if one subject tries to see the other has to move, he has to move, and that means that altogether, if they try to find themselves, they are drive together to the interaction center, and if they go farther, they will be attracted to go back. Is the possibility of reciprocity itself that acts at a distance and leads the participant to the point of attraction. The separation between the subject in the interaction space corresponds to a loss of the attention of others. At the center, the interaction is proximal. If I pay attention to the other participant, she is obliged to pay attention to me. But when I move away from the center, the interaction begins to become distal. When I pay attention to the other participant, nothing ensures that she pays attention to me. So I will go back to that, but we have to look at the result of the analysis of movement on the y-axis, the y velocity as a function of the distance from the point of attraction. And here we observe opposite correlation for the two participants. And this is quite easy to understand. I'll explain it. As I say, in individual space of action, the phenomenology of the subject is still that of a one-dimensional space. But movement on y-axis modifies the dynamic of interaction. If participant R is on the left of the interaction center, like here, it is his interest to go up in Y to bring the interaction center closer. On the contrary, for B, if she is also on the left of the center of interaction, she must go down in Y to bring the center of interaction closer, and vice versa. And the interesting thing is that it is what we observe, it is that the object, the participant managed to do that. So, for some discussion and reflection. At the individual level, it is impossible to determine the position of the interaction center in X or the distance to the partner in Y. No access. It is only through the collective dynamics of interaction that these distances can make sense. As we have seen, there is an effect in X, a tendency to move towards the center of interaction, and an effect in Y, a tendency to move the center of interaction in Y to facilitate movement in X. This is understandable from the perspective of the outside observer. As we have seen, when participants move away from the center of interaction, perceptual crossing become more and more difficult. Therefore, they move to get closer to the center of interaction, that is, to increase the possibility of reciprocity. What is particularly interesting here is that it is as possibility that reciprocity acts on individual dynamics. This effect of the possibility of reciprocity depends on an indirect causality. The fact that I can be felt by my partner affects our behavior, which in turn can affect my own behavior. This effect on individual coupling is not a particular perturbation, but rather a direction of movement in the history of coupling. And at the same time, this movement causes a change in the possibility of reciprocity. I made very detailed slide to help you to follow my poor English. Sorry, and we are near the end. Now, what lesson can we draw from this minimalist experimental study? From a phenomenological point of view, non-reciprocity is not explicitly perceived, but is experienced as a difficulty of the task, a kind of resistance, a tendency to go backwards. Yes, but I have not enough explained that subject who try to go far enough from the interaction center, at the moment couldn't go farther and go back, and they fight to something they don't understand. And this is a loss of attention of other. It is, as it is understood by the subject, a reluctance to follow me. This can be considered as a fundamental form of separation prior to spatial separation. We can understand here so a separation that precedes spatial measurement. The distance can be defined as a dimension in which we are separated. Separation is a loss of control over the attention of others. So, we can say from the point of view of the outside observer that the value of the possibility of reciprocity depends on the distance between the two participants. And in fact, we can even make probability description of this possibility of reciprocity from the point of view of the external observer. But we can now reverse this deduction by taking the participants' point of view. The distance can now be defined and measured by the possibility of reciprocity. The closer the partner is, the more it's possible to capture its attention. Distance is the value of the possibility of reciprocity. Position of the object is where reciprocity is necessary. Position of the point of view relative to the object is a possibility of reciprocity. Then, the position where reciprocity would be necessary, if I put the object, is perceived from a point of view where reciprocity is only possible. Sensorimotor coping with the environment can then be redefined. A sensation only corresponds to the existence of a possibility of reciprocity. An action is a movement that changes the possibility of reciprocity. Thus, space can be understood as a space of possible reciprocities. Action is a displacement of the point of view that is a commitment in the distance of our separation. Any perception of the distance of an object will be the perception of a possibility of reciprocity among a field of other possibility of reciprocity, a field that still is present. So it's this perception, this kind of perception, that open for us a space of possibilities. So to conclude, I hope to have tried to show, in tout cas, that's the track I'm on in, to show that the lived world, the Umwelt, the fact that we are in front of a world of possibilities, that is opened by the encounter with others. And this world couldn't exist without this encounter. So I hope I'm in the time to thank you for listening and perhaps to give me some constructive criticism and suggestion. Thank you.